Thanks, Lisa, for the very nice introduction and free plug of our book. Okay, so I'll get straight into this. In the slide here, you're seeing two examples of river processes. In the image closest to me, that shows a river as it migrates across its floodplain over time. And in the far image, it shows the River Shannon in 2015 after flooding, and the river's connected with floodplain there. So both of these are natural processes that occur in rivers. However, the same natural processes often bring rivers into conflict with people, and those conflicts are likely to become increased because we expect to have more flooding and more erosion in line with more floods. Normally what humans do is they try and control these processes. So in the image closest to me, there's some broken black lines there along the banks, and that's where we've tried to control erosion by putting in hard bank reinforcements. And in the Shannon catchment, all of the tributaries in the Shannon catchment have been channelized or arterial drained. That means the channels have been deepened, widened, and often straightened to disconnect them from their floodplains. It's maybe not the best strategy for the people that live further down the Shannon, but that's where we are now. Okay, so those same processes, when I'm talking about hydromorphology and ecological processes, they're processes of erosion and deposition and processes of plant succession. And in this river here, all of those processes are intact, and because they're working together, that provides very complex habitat for a whole range of, well, not just fish species, but the ones I have here are Atlantic salmon, brown trout, sea trout, eel, lamprey, and a whole multitude of other species. They also infer a kind of natural resilience. These type of intact rivers, they can absorb shock. So it's kind of like, if you want to think about an immune system, a healthy, fit person, they have greater resistance to infection, but they can also recover more quickly when they suffer shock. Whereas if you think about someone that's unfit and has a low immune system, they're more prone and they don't recover as well. So this would be one such example where the river might not recover as well. And this is the first of our hydromorphological pressures today. I'm going to talk a little bit about arterial drainage. So this river is the Stonyford River. It's a tributary in the Boyne system. Quite important river actually in terms of fish production, but it has been arterial drained, much like many of the tributaries in the Shannon. And you can see there that river is disconnected from its floodplain. So that used to all be floodplain, but now they've undertaken land drainage. And while that's been very successful or good in terms of land improvement, it's not particularly good for the species that live in the river. That river also has to be maintained in that state. So what actually happens is it's subject to cyclical dredging. So every 4 to 5 years, that river will be dredged. So you can see an example here in the picture from 2014. That river was just dredged that year, and we went in and we did our hydromorphology condition assessment, and not surprising, the river comes out as bad. So under our WFD assessment, the status there for hydromorphology is bad. We've had a very long conversation with OPW, who do this drainage maintenance, about how we might moderate some of these impacts. And this river is now becoming, like this section, an experimental river, so there's been no dredging in this river now for 10 years. You can see it in the very far picture there in 2024. And we've had really considerable recovery, both in terms of the hydrology, but also in particular in terms of the habitat we see there. And when we went back and did our assessment, it's jumped up 2 classes. So under the WFD, we wanted to reach at least good. So it's headed in the right direction. However, OPW they're legislated to maintain these conditions or maintain these channels as drained channels. So they're supposed to go back in now and redo that channel. So it begs the question, what happens next? And it begs the question, how are we going to reconcile our WFD objectives with other legislation that we already have in place? Okay, another pressure we find that's common in our landscape is flow regulation. So flow regulation occurs where we have dams or reservoirs at the top of river systems, and that usually results in less water in the river and less water when certain species need them. So I'm going to use this graph here to try and illustrate some of that. So this shows a time series for 2 rivers over a 12-month period from June 21 to June 22. The green line there, that's the Glencree River on the east coast of Ireland, and the yellow line is the Vartree system, and the Vartree has a Roundwood Reservoir at the top of it. It's just down the road from Glencree, but you can see they have very different signatures in terms of their hydrograph, so that's water level changes. And what's happening in the Vartree is we're missing these seasonal changes in flow, and those seasonal changes are really important to fish species because their life cycles are integrated or reliant on them. So just as an example, see the Vartree is flat here, whereas the Glencree goes up. That's when we're in October, November. We expect to have higher flows as we head into winter, and that's a trigger for fish to swim upstream and spawn. So we have adult fish that come into the river. They are sea trout or salmon, and they're waiting for that cue to swim up and spawn and complete their life cycle. That trigger is missing in that river. If I head on a bit further into December or January, and we expect to have our really high flows at that time of year, so they're peak flows. They're also habitat-forming flows because that's when we have scour. So gravel is recruited into the river, and that provides the spawning material for our fish, but also that scour creates pools, which is important habitat for our adult fish. But again, that component is missing in a regulated river, as are a whole other variety of components. So because those habitat components are missing in the river, we have to undertake river restoration. So this is an example of a collaborative project that we did with Cuilcha this year on the River Vartree. So we did it with Cuilcha because the river runs through their land. The image nearest me, that's the river pre-restoration, let's call it. Not very homogeneous habitat with really poor substrate because we don't get the right type of substrate in the river because the dam holds it back. So what we've had to do is actually bring gravel in, and that provides suitable spawning material for our fish. And we've also added large wood there, which will create deeper holding areas for adult fish. But I want to emphasize that this is only a stopgap measure. We'll have to go back in a few years and redo this. So to have a more kind of sustainable approach, we have to think about naturalizing some components of our flow, which is maybe something we can discuss later. Okay, regulation is also bad for temperature, especially if you're a cold water species such as salmon or trout. So in the plot nearest to me, they're 3 free-flowing rivers, so they're not regulated, draining off the Dublin Wicklow Mountains. And in the far plot, that's 3 regulated rivers. That's the Slaney, the Dodder, and the Vartree system. The broken blue line, anything above that, you're into suboptimal thermal habitat for these cold water species. Anything above that broken red line, and you're into sublethal thresholds. So those temperatures are really damaging and stressful for fish. If we have extended periods, it could potentially be fatal for them. And you can see quite clearly that regulated rivers are a lot warmer, and that means that in terms of climate change resilience, we couldn't consider those systems resilient. So that suggests to us there needs to be some intervention there. And my final hydromorphological pressure is land use change. So this was raised earlier. The pictures you see here are from a valley in the west of Ireland. Now we often think of these valleys as being kind of pristine or wild, but to be honest, they're really anything but. Previously, they would have been covered with blanket bog peatlands, wetlands, and broadleaf woodland. Now what we find is rough pasture on the hills, improved grassline on the valley floor, and the slopes tend to be covered in coniferous forestry. So all of that land use modification has altered hydrology in these systems, but it's also altered the thermal regime. So this is a plot from summer of 2022. I was quite curious to see, what type of thermal habitat this river would provide for these fish species, because these are really important rivers in terms of salmonid production. So I put a logger into the river, into a pool, and the logger records depth data and records temperature data. So the blue line there is changes in depth, and the red line is changes in temperature. And what we can quite clearly see is that when you get these just here, so these very low flows, so any kind of few days without any rain, and the river drops, so it's on its bones, but then we see very sudden spikes in temperature. And again, we're into above the blue broken line, suboptimal, above the red broken line into sublethal temperatures. So we can't really even consider those what are supposedly our natural rivers as being resilient to climate change. But I do have a little bit of good news. And that is that the landowner owns that particular valley. He's a fairly extensive landowner. He's decided he wants to put the river back into something else. So we're undertaking a landscape restoration project, and that will involve measures such as re-wetting. So that's an attempt to hold water back, to slow it down, to provide attenuation, so the water is let back out into the river more gradually, and also an increase in riparian tree cover, and that will help regulate stream temperatures. So it's not just about biodiversity. For anyone that's downstream from that, we also get flood attenuation, and of course, wetter ground will provide for carbon sequestration. Okay, so I'll just wrap up. So what I want to say is we're talking about climate change and climate change resilience, but all of those pressures are already there in the landscape. Climate change is now imposed on top of them, so we have a fairly significant deficit there already. We have competing sectoral interests, so IFI want to do one thing, but we've other utilities there undertaking flow regulations such as Ishka Airn, or we've OPWs, and we're often in conflict with each other, which is the reason we're here together, to try and have a more kind of harmonised approach. Land use policy, I wasn't having a pop at landowners when I showed the valleys that were very degraded. Those landowners have just been following what the incentives are. So they're following policy. If we want to put it into something more natural, we have to incentivise them to do that. And ultimately, if we kind of can get those three together, we'll be kind of somewhere towards space for rivers. Okay, Sinead.